Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center. My name is Susan Derwin. I'm the director of the IHC, and we're just delighted to have you here for today's talk, which is part of our 2025-26 public events series on fire. And the speakers in our series have been exploring and will continue to explore both the precarity and the resilience of our natural and social environments and of the systems, institutions, and cultural formations that anchor them. I would like to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center is located, and I would also like to pay respect to elders, past and present, as well as other Indigenous people who are here today. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Bruno Perreau. Bruno Perreau is the Cynthia L. Reed Professor of French Studies at MIT and faculty affiliate at the Minda de Gunsberg Center for European Studies at Harvard University. He is also founding director of MIT's Center of Excellence in French Studies. He researches and teaches in the areas of queer theory in France and the U.S., kinship, adoption, and bioethics, social, legal, and political theory, minority politics in a global context, and identity, media, and class in 20th and 21st century French literature. He is the author of 13 books, including The Politics of Adoption, Queer Theory, The French Response, and most recently, Spheres of Injustice, The Ethical Promise of Minority Presence, which appeared this year with MIT Press. He earned his PhD in political science from the University of Paris I, and he taught for 10 years in Paris at Sciences Po. He has been a fellow at numerous institutes and centers, including the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton and the Stanford Humanities Center. And in spring 2026, he'll be a visiting faculty member at the Paris Institute of Political Studies. And in 2026, he was named Knight of the Order of Academic Palms by decree of the French Prime Minister. This distinction is awarded for significant contributions to French education, culture, and science. I am grateful to Stephanie Malia Hom for suggesting that we invite Bruno Perreau to participate in the IHC's On Fire series. And now please join me in welcoming him to speak to us about Spheres of Injustice, Minority Politics today. Welcome.
All right. Thank you very much for your warm welcome, Susan, and thank you to the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center at a time when higher education is under attack and treated as a corporate commodity. It's great and it's heartwarming to be here and see an institution, donors, faculty, administrators who care about public humanities. And in a way, my talk will address how we can tackle strategically the notion of what's public today and how make it a critical tool to resist this commodification. I'm also very thankful to Chris Boberg for your incredible organization and logistical support, and Stephanie Malia Hom for initiating the event. So my presentation today will be about this book, Spheres of Injustice. The subtitle in English is The Ethical Promise of Minority Presence. It's a slightly different subtitle in French, Pour un universalisme minoritaire, which roughly means toward minority universalism. I'll probably say a little bit more during the talk, at least diagonally. My goal today is obviously not to do this, that is to say, to give you an entire overview of the book. But in a nutshell, the book argues that rethinking the resonances between minority experience contributes to deepening democracy today. And giving it a ethical spin, not just fundamental rights, not just checks and balances, but also an ethical dimension. So what I do in the book is to try to think or rethink the notion of minority in a more relational way, not just in legal terms, that is to say statutorily speaking. Then I examine the challenges, the main challenges the notion of minority faces today. I do this by comparing France and the United States, but more broadly, European politics and law and North American politics and law, with also a few other examples outside this transatlantic scheme. These challenges are numerous, but especially the complexity of the law, because it's not only a matter of having statuses to protect you. One also have to be aware of those statuses and also identify with those statuses. And the more complex the law becomes, the more challenging it is in a way to be protected. What numerically being a minority and being part of the majority means has also dramatically changed in the algorithmic era. So I will say a few words later about that. So that's a challenge as well. Obviously, the way conservative groups instrumentalize the notion of minority by claiming they are minority groups themselves and need to be protected by the law in the name of their freedom of expression to better target minority groups. And it's not just a legal question, it's also a social, political strategy by reappropriating slogans, designs by minority groups, workers' rights movements, feminist movements, indigenous people movements, and so on and so forth, which is something I won't talk much, but I'm happy during the discussion to say more about that, because it's the core of the previous book on queer theory and the fantasies of a new form of wokeism, gender theory, which actually was very strong in France more than 20 years ago. And obviously one important and last challenge, the way those conservative groups try to pit minority groups against each others, and that's a good example with affirmative action, the two cases with North Carolina and Harvard, and I will also say a few words about that. And then the book tried to offer different theoretical responses and conceptual responses to those challenges in terms of social movements, in terms of legal practices, and also political concepts by redefining the notion of universalism. So you still get an overall vision or view of the book. I'm sorry about that. At least everybody is now on fire. But what I'm going to do is to, of course, zoom in, and I will start by saying a few words about the context that led me to writing the book. Then I'll narrow down and explain why the book is titled Spheres of Injustice, and what does it mean to think the notion or rethink the notion of minority more relationally, and the consequences in terms of legal and political theories. I will present you the notion of intrasectionality that I coined in the book, say a few words about dissociative universalism, and evoke the new book project, if I have enough time for so doing. So let's start. The starting point of the book is actually not me, but a colleague of mine. Véronique Mautier, so I always like to move, so let me do that. 1, 2, yes, perfect. Véronique Mautier, who edited a book, Genre, Droit et Politique, so Gender, Law and Politics, and so she asked me if I could write a chapter for the book. And it's true that in a previous life, when I was in France, I used to teach constitutional law and political science. But when I moved to the United States, I've been appointed at MIT as a French studies faculty, so I'm in the humanities. It doesn't mean that I don't teach classes on French politics, but it's definitely not the same angle. So I hesitated I said, no, I'm not sure. Are you really sure I'm the right person to do that? I haven't really worked on anti-discrimination law for a while. She insisted, and I gave up. I accepted, and it was a really good idea to accept. And the article is based on a decision by the Court of the Justice of the European Communities, which is now called European Court of Justice, which I had found very interested at the time, but never really studied, so it was the occasion. The decision Grant versus Southwest Trains, which is the case of a lesbian couple in England, one of whom worked for a train company, and the partner didn't benefit from preferential rates. Because at the time you had to be an official couple, aka be married, and there was no marriage equality at the end of the 90s. So they sued the company. And interestingly, the lawyer, because at the time sexual orientation was not really well protected by the European Union law, the lawyers used a different kind of argument, that of gender, by saying, if this woman had been a man, she would have been able to marry, so she would have been able to benefit from preferential rates. So the court didn't follow this reasoning, but it somehow triggered a new form of analogical thinking in European law. I will talk today both about EU law and the law of the Council of Europe, which is a broader institution, a more continental institution. But both courts work together. So the interesting part here is that it's not only a practical argument, it's also conceptually powerful to consider that the way one person is, to put it in Foucauldian terms, the way one person is governed has an impact on the government of others. And that there is a chain of protection that exists between different protected classes. So that's the first sort of impulse to writing the book. The second is that I taught at Sciences Po for close to 10 years, and I participated in the development on affirmative action programs, even if France didn't want to call that affirmative action, but discrimination positive, so positive discrimination, which is obviously oxymoric and has actually negative performative consequences. But still, Sciences Po, which is the equivalent of the Kennedy School of Government, more or less, so an elite university of political science, started to target underprivileged areas in France, inform high school students about the possibility to go or to join Sciences Po, or at least to apply for Sciences Po, since one of the core mechanisms of social stratification and social exclusion in that matter is self-disqualification. So you need to do a lot of outreach to let people know that it is a possibility. And when some students actually join the university, the program, and so on and so forth, then they become also model for others. Hence the affirmative dimension of affirmative action. Which is precisely what had been dismounted both by the federal government and the Supreme Court in 2023. So I started to teach there. This is also something that I studied with historian John Scott in a book, Les Défis de la République, where we asked the question about the best practices to transform the law by playing on different levels and registers. And it's a book that studies parity laws, so laws for equal representation of men and women in politics in particular. Now, so I participated in the development of affirmative action at Sciences Po by doing mentoring work and tutorial sessions and for the students. But also, as a teacher, I really made a point of explaining to my students that having been selected through this specific procedure was as worth as praiseful in a way, than being selected by the traditional admission procedure. My goal was to even tell the students, those who had been admitted the traditional way, let's say, that they might not have been selected if they had to have the other exam, which was more focused on the trajectory and less, sort of socially legitimate questions. And I observed that each student started to think critically about their trajectory. Not only the underprivileged students, but also the very privileged students, students coming from the countryside, students who basically started to be proud of their trajectory. Now, this was within the realm of the classroom and under my authority. So, if the teacher or the instructor sets a principle, students tend or try to follow the principle, if not because they approve it, but at least to get a good grade eventually. I couldn't help but overhear students, very privileged students, in the corridor talking about Sciences Po and disqualifying Sciences Po, saying, we don't need to be here. We're here, it's great, but we could do anything else, right? So interestingly, when newcomers arrive, those who had the best chances to become Sciences Po students developed a new strategy, which is to distance themselves from Sciences Po and to distance themselves from the newcomers who had no choice but to be very attached to the institution and to become almost the ambassadors of the institution. And that's a key thing in the relationship between minority groups and majority group. The reluctance to admit forms of criticisms when the criticism comes from minority group. It's almost immediately perceived as a form of disloyalty, while the exact same criticism developed by another group will be considered worth it. So in a way, pedagogy of reciprocity is always difficult if you don't practice also a pedagogy of criticality. That is to say, in that case, have the student think or tackle the question of what it means to be a student at an elite school. What does the notion of elite entails? And how they are transforming that. This case is interesting, of course, because France, because of all kind of historical reasons and constitutional reasons, cannot use criteria based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or gender for admissions. So the trick is to actually use the territory as a form of proxy, in a way, because of social segregation and racial segregation. You might end up having similar impact, which is a big challenge today with the decision of the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court in Harvard's case, I mean, you know that by heart, so I can probably skip that for now. But interestingly, the consequences has been immediately. I have some stats for MIT. The number of African American students after the decision of the Supreme Court dropped from an average of 13% to 5% in 1 year. But it goes even further now, because the federal administration is also especially the Department of Justice, also edits all form of documents to try and identify what could be affirmative action by proxy. Right, so that's also the second sort of starting point for the book. But I hope you hear that in my pedagogy, I also had this experience of resonances between different minority experiences, and that somehow echoed the article on the association between gender and sexual orientation. Now, there is also a more subjective experience, which was mine when I was at MIT during the Pulse attack, so in Orlando, Florida, which I obviously felt very directly as a gay man. You have also here the consequences of the current administration policy by targeting so-called political banners on the roadways, and so erasing rainbow crosswalks, and especially where the attack occurred. And when George Floyd was murdered, I couldn't help but feel not only a sort of resonance in terms of political violence as a human being, but also because it sort of triggered mechanisms that I had embodied as a gay man who had been bullied, who had to, face insults and all forms of discrimination in my life. I will say more about that later, because I'm absolutely not saying that minority experiences are similar and or equivalent. But what I'm saying is that the violence against one minority group is a call to order for all minority groups, and that there is a form of connection that needs to be acknowledged. Here are images of protests in Paris by the Adama Comité Justice pour Adama. So Adama Traoré was a young black man killed in very similar circumstances than George Floyd by the French police 5 years before. Assa Traoré, her sister, created a committee to know the truth about the death of her brother. And interestingly, in many demonstrations, the young people there made direct references to Black Lives Matter, I Can Breathe here. There were murals merging the faces of Adama Traoré and George Floyd in different places in Paris, or outside Paris. Actually, one of them was vandalized very quickly afterwards. And the political reactions, not only from the government, this was the Minister of the Interior, but basically from the left to the right and the extreme right, including the far-right police union Alliance, was to refuse this reference to the United States by saying, France is not the US, and with some objective reasons. Obviously, this police is not structured the same way. It's a national police mostly. There's not a similar circulation of weapons in France compared to the US, but they missed the core dimension, which is the substitutability of racialized body. We've seen people being assassinated in all kinds of circumstances, by jogging, a kid holding a water pistol, somebody having a nap in her car. And this fundamental and it's also evidenced quite well when the cousin of Patrice Cullors, who founded Black Lives Matter, was killed by UCLA police, and he said, they're trying to George Floyd me. So there is a real conscious of this substitutability, this connection to the violence experienced by others. Now, the book tries to question whether this, sort of experience, subjective experience, resonates beyond the very limits of the group itself. And my argument is that this is another example that actually completely undermines the argument of the French government that connects different forms of racist police violences in France and the US. You can see in New York on this mural the name of Adama Traoré right here. So what the book is about is trying to see what kind of resonances exist from a legal point of view, from a social point of view, from a subjective point of view between different experiences of discrimination, insult, violence, etc. And I don't assume at all that there is a sort of leaning or natural convergence of struggles, quite the opposite. Forms of violence are very different. Bodies can be attacked because they are overly visibilized, or because there are invisible, or both at the same time, depending on the context as well. So there are very, very specific experiences. But once again, also there's another dimension, which is that if we assume that fighting against homophobia, fighting against sexism, fighting against ableism, against racism, just work hand in hand, we tend to undermine the differences in terms of resources, who has the ability to speak, and as long as you have spokespersons, then indeed you substitute one speech for another. So this shouldn't be undermined, and this is the argument that Hastrolovich makes in her book, Affirmative Advocacy, when she shows basically that the more minority you are in a minority coalition, the more you have to do the work yourself. However, these connections, they already exist, at least negatively, because conservative groups are very well aware that when you attack here, you also attack there, that there are resonances beyond the very place where you attack a group. Typically, just one example, but I could give many others. In the decision of the Supreme Court, Dobbs, Justice Clarence Thomas was very clear in his opinions about the next steps, where he basically said the Supreme Court will have to reevaluate sexual education, contraception, and also not only the legalization of gay marriage, but the legalization of homosexuality itself. Right. And we are in the middle of it right now. As you know, the Supreme Court on November 7 will review a case to know if it grants. This is a word that is almost impossible for me to pronounce. So be as attentive as possible. So I will try to say certiorari. Is it okay? Certiorari. You know, when you give, I know I wouldn't be able to pronounce that. Certiorari, yes. Grant certiorari in law, it means you grant somebody the ability to have his or her or their case reviewed, basically. So that's what's going to happen on November 7 about the celebration of gay marriage with a Kentucky court clerk who refused to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples. And also recently, the Texas Supreme Court changed its judicial conduct rules to allow judges to refuse to perform same-sex marriages. And each time it's with the same logic to try from these very cases to target Obergefell. Right. And last reason for which I decided to work on this topic, the resonances between different minority experiences, is that we live in a global age with an acceleration of course, communication, economic exchanges, and the destruction of the environment, which means that our moral capacity to care about others is also being challenged. Humans have a limited cognitive capacity. They have also limited resources in terms of time, energy, and so on and so forth. So the response to global warming, for instance, can be what I just mentioned is what Norbert Elias, the sociologist, called the lengthening of interdependency chains. The sort of immediate response is to try to think cosmopolitically by saying, well, we have to care about the entire planet, right? The problem of that is that to care about the entire planet, you have to agree on principles, on things that we have in common. But the very notion of what's in common varies from a culture to another, from a class to another, from a social group to another. So in a way, our moral responsibility has not been redefined at the same pace than the sort of major economic, environmental, and also political changes that we are witnessing. So and a good also example that shows the limits of the cosmopolitan approach is obviously the way CEOs in California try to think that they will survive global warming by buying islands, protected from the rest of the world. So these two philosophers that I study in the book, Maurice Blanchot and Jean-Luc Nancy, had a quite radical view of this question of moral commonality. Maurice Blanchot, this is a quote from The Madness of the Day, but he also wrote a book called The Unavowable Community, where he explains that the only thing we have in common is death. And the problem with that, we truly have in common. The problem with that is that when it happens, it's precisely something that we cannot grasp. So there's actually nothing really in common, and we have to come up with other forms of other solutions in a way to live together, function together. And Jean-Luc Nancy sort of piggybacked on that by explaining that we sort of co-appear, what he called comparution. We co-appear together on the social stage. And all the work that needs to be done for social theorists is to think this with. We appear with the other. All right. So you have the landscape. So basically what led me to the project, which is always like this at first when you start to work on a topic, there's also a form of intuition, right? So how can you make it a research project? Well, you study jurisprudence, what I did on both sides of the Atlantic, but you also have to find a way to connect the pieces of the puzzle. And this is what I did by rereading Michael Walzer's book, Spheres of Justice, A Defense of Pluralism and Equality. I don't know if you're familiar with Walzer's work, but so I'm going to try to sum up that, and it might be a little too simplistic. But he started to work on this project at the beginning of the 70s when he taught at Harvard with Robert Nozick. Their idea was to, in the wake of John Rawls' major book on Theory of Justice, itself published in 1971, to try and think what are the sort of conceptual apparatuses that allows us to maximize equality, which is what Rawls' books is about. You probably know Rawls' books for the notion of the veil of ignorance. It might ring a bell. That's obviously it does for you. So once again, I'm going to be a little caricatural here, but a long story short, Rawls tries to identify the best possible conditions for equality, and he develops this idea that if we consider that we live under a veil of ignorance, that is to say, we don't exactly know because of the complexity of the world, the very position that we occupy in this world. When it comes to making a decision, then we should be inclined to choose the most protective option in case we would need it. So if you have, let's say, $100 to share between two people, the logic should be to go for 50-50 in case you get 0 and not 100, right? The problem, of course, is that it's a bit more complicated in the real world, beyond the world of theory, because people accumulate enough social and symbolic and economic resources that leads them to make choices that are not necessarily the most protective ones. Because you might consider that, well, I'm going to get 0 if I have the possibility to get 100 rather than getting 50-50. So Walzer's argument is to try and revisit Rawls' theory by showing that the very notion of equality varies from a sphere to another. Because we don't... The meaning of justice is not the same in the family, at at the workplace, in our relationships with friends, in the sort of, medical interactions and so on and so forth. It might be sometimes more associated with solicitude, in other circumstances with competition, in other circumstances with solidarity, and so on and so forth. So his point is to say that if we zoom in, and if we want to maximize shared understanding about social goods, that is to say, all the things that makes our lives. So social goods, it's both, this is a social good, but proud is a social good. Our identity is a social good. So are many different kinds of social goods. But if we want to have these social goods sort of be articulated to one another, then we have to acknowledge the fact that depending on the sphere, the meaning of justice is different. And his goal is to fragment inequalities. It's a quite realistic, in a way, theory to say that if we live in a complex world, there will always be inequalities. Because in the very act of resisting a norm, we cannot not recreate other norms. These norms might probably be less, or hopefully be less oppressive, but still, we, by our very... Sure. When you resist a norm, right? If you resist an idea that is an idea you stand against, to resist this, so it means that you fight against an injustice. To fight against an injustice, it means that in your sort of moral background, you also have a certain idea about what's just and what's unjust, all right? So you tackle an injustice, but to tackle an injustice, you have to hinge on a certain number of representations. And these representations are also hierarchical. They might be less hierarchical and hopefully less hierarchical than what you're fighting against, but they are still norms. So for Walzer, there is a form of reproduction because of the complexity of the social world, which leads him to try, rather than completely eradicate inequality, to try to fragment inequalities. And if we fragment inequalities to a level where they become insignificant, then we have a powerful approach. Now, there were some important rebuttal against this theory by thinking, well, it might be great practically speaking, but when you face the accumulation of privileges, aka a systemic discrimination, then it might be too weak of a conceptual response. It's also a majority theory. Let me give you an example, and that's why I reread Walzer's work. He explains that in a village society where grain is distributed very unevenly between people, people seem quite happy about that. There is an agreement on this inequality. So for him, there is no need to have sort of political intervention to redistribute the grain because there is an agreement. And that's why, or where I disagree with him very strongly, because inequalities are embodied in a way that goes beyond the idea of a simple argument. So that's one of the limits of pluralism, because indeed, injustice, it's not just what's sort of obvious. It's also all kind of layers that are sometimes less perceivable. If you think about the experience of justice, it's obviously the direct experience of justice, of injustice. You're in the streets and you're insulted by somebody. You receive a salary which is lower than your colleague because you're a woman. You're attacked because you're a black man, and so on and so forth. So that's a direct experience of injustice. But injustice has also a spectral dimension. By spectral, I mean that we are exposed to the potentiality of injustice. If you take the example, once again, of a woman walking at night in the streets of a city, she might not be harassed or attacked, but she knows that it's a possibility. And knowing that it's a possibility means that you anticipate, you embody this possibility, and you limit the range of your freedom, right? And it's also the spectacle of injustice. By spectacle, I mean what happens, and that's where I started from with the example of George Floyd, when you witness an injustice. And that's a very tricky experience, because on the one hand, it's a call to order, for sure, for some people. But it might also be, even if it's something that we might not want to address because it's not necessarily the best side of us, but it's also sometimes a certain form of relief, at least at the unconscious level, because for once, you're not the victim, and the victim is somebody else. So there is a tension here that needs to be tackled. And that's also quite interesting to understand why some members of minority groups actually support political groups, which are groups that actually are against their own rights. Because of this sort of paradoxical dimension where they feel that they might be better protective if they are closer to the enemy, in a way. So this is there are all kind of epistemic dimensions in justice that I tackle in the book. Miranda Fricker, the philosopher, speaks about, on the one hand, what she calls hermeneutic injustices, that is to say, the lack of interpretative resources, but also testimonial injustices, the fact that you're not taken seriously, and that you have to prove more, to evidence more, and that you ask as a minority to sort of deny who you are to claim that you have a certain authority or role to play vis-à-vis others. I think I'm going to completely skip that, but I'm happy to come back to it. If not, I won't have to enough time to come to the conclusion. But just one word so that you're not too frustrated. You probably understand I haven't said that explicitly, that the way I conceive the notion of minority is not a matter of number. It's a matter of political, social, economic oppression. It's an unfavorable power dynamic. Now, it doesn't mean that numbers do not matter. With my approach, if you're black in South Africa, you are in the minority, even if you're the majority of the population. If you're women, as you are in some countries, the majority of the population, you are in the minority, right? But my point is that if you are in the minority and representing 0.1% of the population or 60% of the population, it's not the same kind of oppression. So numbers still matter, and the relationship to numbers is being redefined by algorithms, for sure, because it's not just the law of the greatest number, it's also the law of the average number, so to speak. The average behavior is the one that is more statistically likely to happen. To give one example, you go online, you call not to offend anybody. So I call one of my friends, my lovely or dear faggot, for instance. For me, it's a word of love. Within my community, it's a vernacular term that my community has appropriated. But that's not how Facebook or Instagram understand that, because the statistical law is the law of the average number. So that's another challenge. So what I'm trying to get at is that, and that's where French and the difference between the French subtitle and the English subtitle is useful. Because we don't say really easily in English being minoritarian or I am a minority. You can say it, but it's better to say I'm part of a minority group or in the minority. But French use minoritaire, the adjective, which is very convenient because it can designate a person without substantializing this person or essentializing this person. This is, in essence, this is a pun intended, what Colette Guillaumin wrote in her article. In certain social relationships, individuals belonging to minority groups have majority status even if it is not fully exercised because it is limited by minority membership with respect to Black Americans. All whites, be they women, workers, foreigners, Jews, are in a majority relationship. For non-citizen foreigners or national, whoever they may be, stand in a majority relationship to them. We are therefore unable to define minorities or the majority in asymmetrical balance based on a set of stable and constant characteristics. My point here is that it matters to think about minority relations. We are in the minority in relation to a majority group. This relation is a complex relation. It's a changing relation. And it has different layers. So you can be, let's say, at the macro level in the minority, but not at the micro level, or vice versa, depending on the context. Let me be very concrete. If I, pick up the phone and say, "Hi, Bruno Perreau on the phone," I'm not sure I'm not saying that it doesn't play a role at all, but I don't think the gay dimension of my identity is the most important dimension in this sort of phone interaction. My accent might actually plays a greater role because the person doesn't know me and immediately think, "Oh, who is this person?" This is the reason for which when I call, let's say, a hospital to make an appointment, I always pick up the phone and say, "Hi, Professor Perreau," on the phone, because they don't know if you're a cardiologist or a humanist, but you get an appointment sooner for sure. If I don't say that, I know that because of my accent, I suddenly become a migrant. And suddenly people imply on the phone that I understand less, what's at stake, and that maybe it's less urgent to have an appointment, and so on and so forth. So my point here is that contextually, we are positioned differently in our minority-majority relationship. Once again, it doesn't mean that legal statuses to protect people are not needed, because there is an accumulation of privileges, and of course, some categories that are systemically discriminated against. And that's why we need a law to protect people who face a systemic discrimination. But once again, if we tap into the multi-positionality, we might also have a powerful tool. And this is what law evidences, and what I try to develop with the notion of intrasectionality. I'll try also to be as brief as possible. You probably already know the concept of intersectionality developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, which addresses the complex discrimination when you are at the intersection of different protected class. So let's say, and in several of her articles, but this one in particular, she focuses on domestic violences against Black women. And her argument is to say that it's not just a matter of race and a matter of sexism, or a combination of both. It's a dynamic. And what the law needs to understand is the dynamic of it. If not, if we consider that it's just one discrimination plus another discrimination, then it's in a way easier for those who discriminate to prove that they don't, or to try and prove that they don't. Because let's say that you are an employer, you will be able to say, and you discriminate Black women. You can say, well, I have appointed Black men, I have appointed white women, and I don't discriminate Black women. So that's actually the trick, to try and understand the dynamic of it. So it's a very powerful argument that she makes, and a very successful one. The problem with this is that the more complex the intersection is, the more difficult it is to practically evidence discrimination. What law does is to compare cases. It's very basic. You have a protected class and you have an instance. You measure what happened to one person, if this person was mistreated compared to another person. You take one criteria that varies between them, and if there is indeed a difference in treatment, and that this difference in treatment is protected, then there is discrimination and there can be compensations and so on and so forth. If you take 5, 6, 7 criteria at the same time, what will be the logical sort of outcome or of the review. For the judge, it will be to say, well, these two people or that I have compared, or these two groups of people that I have compared, they are in unique situations, in singular situations. Hence, I cannot prove a discrimination. So sometimes it's better to just take one criteria. This is what the European Court of Justice said in this case. But to study this criteria by acknowledging other cases regarding other criteria. So once again, it's a form of analogical thinking that doesn't mean that it's the same kind of discriminations, but you can learn from one discrimination to better protect others. This is a case, I'm going to say a few words about others, but this is a case where a woman had been had to undergo surgery that mutilate her, and she couldn't feel sexual pleasure after that, and the surgeon had not informed her about the consequences of the surgery. And gender, was used in that case, but it was used to protect a discrimination also based on age, because it's also the stereotypes associated with, lack of sexual desire with age. That was involved, but the stereotype associated with gender help the judge prove discrimination on the basis of age. For a long time in the U.S., a category was used to protect another when a category was missing. So that's how race protected or was used to protect gender. And more recently, gender used to protect sexual orientation. So there is a form of extension of the legal domain that is happening, especially in European law. Let me give you another example. Let's say that the Di case, it's an interesting case where a father of a person with a disability was protected as if he was in a situation of disability himself. Because when you provide care to a person with disability, it has consequences on your ability to work full-time and have the same amount of revenues. So there was an extension of the category in that regard. And so in that case, the father could have been considered as in the majority in a way. But because he had this connection with the son, it resonated with him. Or you have other cases. I cannot review all of them, but I'm happy to say something about this one, which I really like. It's a case where an association, an organization of senior women over the age of 80 years old, they sued Switzerland for climate inaction. And they used their minority situation by saying, because we are older, we are more exposed to heat waves. Hence, when you don't do enough to reduce climate warming, it's a direct attack on us. And the European Court of Human Rights actually considered that this argument was valid. And now there is an opposable right for living in a sane environment in Europe. Right. Maybe last few words. So my point is that if you actually connect different forms of discrimination, and the notion of intrasectionality refers to the fact that we are the bearers of other lives in a way. This is the presence of others in us. So when there is a discrimination against another person, it has implications for us. This is also how the jurisprudence on disability led to protecting people who had a temporary health problem. If you break your leg, you're not in a situation of disability to the extent that there's nothing systemic about it. But you definitely face some challenges in terms of ability to move around and access to public buildings, for instance. So my point here is that it's essential to, of course, recognize the systemic discrimination and the statuses associated with systemic discrimination, but also recognize their usefulness for other cases, including those which can concern the majority, because the majority might have some minority experiences, less durable, less intense, more local, but still these experiences exist, and they are also a political sort of resources that is useful to tap into. Now, this leads me to critique the way the notion of universalism, because of course of years of instrumentalization by different project of domination, including colonialism, is so sulfurous in a way that it's not necessarily used by minority groups. And I think it's still important to do so. This is what a certain number of philosophers like Suleiman Bashir Diagne or Kwame Anthony Appiah have done by saying we have to have another approach to universalism, not as an abstract principle or set of principle, but as something that is rooted in the experience. There is a form of aspiration to the universal, the aspiration to live beyond oneself, that shouldn't be left in the hands of the majority solely. And other scholars have also tried to develop the idea of alternative universalisms. Walser himself, by talking about universalism by reiteration. So if you repeat a behavior at some point, this behavior becomes a general rule. Monique Wittig, the French writer, spoke about l'universalisme oblique in the oblique. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, lateral universalism. But my point is a little different. It's to insist on the dissociative dimension in minority experiences. By dissociative experiences or dimension, I mean that the sense of belonging, it's not only based on the idea of communality, but on the capacity or the ability to take a certain distance with this idea or fantasy of communality. This is what I said earlier. If you are in the majority group and you criticize a law which you find unjust, this might be considered as a way to improve the law. The same criticism, but done by a group of young people from the suburbs, will be seen as a form of disloyalty to the state. And then you have this long rhetoric of the enemy within that is still very much in the air today. So I think it's valuable to also consider this need to dissociate in minority experiences. Let me take one example, concrete example. If you're an LGBT asylum seeker, right? So you move from a country to another and you ask for asylum. The law will ask you to associate strongly with a new country by saying, trying to prove why it matters for you to be there and how this country can protect you. And you have to provide evidences of the discrimination that you faced, and very often a risk of death, in the country where you used to live. The problem is that if you had proofs, you would be dead, basically. So the reason for which you're still alive is because you've been able, in a way, not to be too obviously who you are, and that allowed you to escape, and you need protection. And when you move to another country, often you're still very dependent on the communities of people who come from this country as well, and where you cannot necessarily be open about your sexuality or gender identity. So basically, this logic of association can actually, in a way, threaten you even more, right? Once again, I took the example of the walking in the streets a bit earlier. If I walk, let me take a concrete example. Maybe 8 years, 9 years, 10 years ago, I was in the Castro in San Francisco. Probably one of this area in the US and in the world where I'm supposed to feel the safest, right? A car passed by, windows open, 4 guys, and one shouted, "We'll kill you, faggot," like out of the blue. It was not the first time that it happened in my life. I was already probably 40 years old at the time. But it hit me to the core because of the location where it happened. Because for once, in a way, I had lowered down my defenses. And what I want to point at is that under some circumstances, sometimes you need to detach yourself from who you are if you want to be safe, if you want to evolve strategically in the social world. So this sort of compulsory association in a form of mandatory belonging it can actually threaten minority groups. And there is, and this is why I sort of contest recognition theories. For instance, Axel Honneth wrote a book, The Struggle for Recognition, where he insists on the fact that being recognized is a core element in somebody's psychological well-being, evolution as a person. So in a way, the presence of other restores our sovereignty, which, it's one aspect of our experience. But sometimes contesting self-sovereignty is also a form of existence. This is what Jean Genet, the French writer, did when he glorified the figure of the thief by showing that when you dissociate from the society, you can actually also gain power and agency. And Honneth developed a theory by reading Hegel, and Judith Butler offered another reading of Hegel, which leads towards the same direction by saying, in a way, when we are expected to... I will backpedal and say one more thing, and that will be my conclusion, so that there's enough time for questions. But backpedaling, I need to mention something about the notion of authenticity. Sartre explains that very well in Nothing and the Being and the Nothing, L'être et le néant. He has pages where he explains that for a homosexual, there is a conflict between being identified as such or not being identified as such. If you're in the closet, let's say, the other has some power over you because there is a secrecy that might be, become public. And so this unknown dimension is a form of dependency, right? But when you come out, doesn't mean that everything is solved in a snap, because when you come out, then you might be reduced to this very dimension. And Sartre says, c'est un pédéraste, which means that any action that you do can be limited to this very dimension of you. That's why minority groups sometimes have to refrain from talking about their statuses, what they do, and this is what you explain so well in your work on tacit racism. Because if you actually are only in a, if you don't acknowledge this tension or this dilemma of authenticity, you're trapped between two limitations to your freedom. And Judith Butler says, actually, this dilemma is an ethical resource, because it means that it is a form of opacity to whom we are, and this opacity to whom we are is also a form of, can lead to more patience toward others, can provide other forms to approach other people's identity. In other words, it's a way to conceive of presence, the one I explained, the presence of others in us, not only as a resource from the outside, but the acknowledgement of our incompletedness. And this is what in a way, this text will probably know, well, I'll skip it. I think I don't have time to say more about it. But let's go directly to Unlived Lives. This acknowledgement of the uncompletedness is a form of decentering, right? So it's not only that we are constituted by the life of others, and there are resonances between different kinds of experiences, but the logical conclusion of that is that we are also defined by all the things that we are not, and that others remind us of. You know, the child that you never had, the job you never took, the place where you've never been. All these spectral dimensions, all these unrealized biographical possibilities are part of us. And they are part of us, and now they are the target of algorithms. When algorithms calculate the most likely option, they do so by doing statistical tests, and compare the most likely option to other options which are less likely, which means that these less likely options, these paths of life that will never happen, they're still embedded in the very option that they offer you. And so that's what I tried to do in the new book, which is to tackle this form of hollow relationship to ourselves, and by working on literature, because obviously literature is a key experience of facing our unlived lives, which are reactivated by the fictions that we face. And that's why I consider fiction always as a form of counterfiction. And it's also a way for me to reread Judith Butler's theory of excitable speech. Excitable, it's also excitable. What I argue is that at a time of social media, our unlived lives return to the fore. They are constantly cited by the overexposures to the life of others, which is in a way another form of resonance, but not so much with other groups, but resonance with who we are not, aka to connect presence, which is at the core of my book, ethical presence and absence. Thank you very much. Oh, so I want to die for president. I want a person with AIDS for president. I'm doing the professor here. Do you know this text, the artist who did that? No, nobody? So I'm going to read it a bit more because I want a president that had an abortion at 16, and I want a candidate who I cannot see it. Who isn't the lesser of two evils, and I want a president who lost their last lover to AIDS, who still sees that in their eyes every time they lay down to rest, etc., etc. Interestingly, in the text, I have it here. It's what I also find interesting. I will give you the solution eventually. But what I find interesting also is this particular relationship, presence, absence, having left, what was removed from the text in the very text, and the idea of so inert, it was not so much that, and that's my point, that there is a sort of moral virtue in being in the minority, but a positional, ethical possibility that is powerful. Yes, so that's why there's this text.
Oh, you said Zoe Leonard,
Yeah.
1992.
Yeah, thank you very much. My pronunciation is always not the most accurate.
So we have a microphone, and so you can raise your question on it. You might close.
Yes, don't be shy. Fears, rules, invitations.
Thank you, Bruno. Merci beaucoup. Just sort of continuing on our conversation from last night, but I was curious I'm incredibly impressed, and thank you for this great talk. What you're describing in terms of minority politics and this ethics, it's a very complex position, right? Because it occupies, it doesn't occupy, it's always changing. You're at times in the minority, the majority, and this. It describes a complexity that seems at odds with our present moment, where, in fact, the opposite tendency, this pushing toward reduction, hyper-reduction, simplification, how do you reconcile that with that present moment?
The core proposition is to acknowledge this complexity and, in a way, sort of impose this complexity. If we, let's be very direct, one of the core characteristics of reactionary discourses is its incoherence. One thing and the exact opposite can be said in the very same sentence, which makes it very difficult, of course, for people who want to fight these kind of discourses, because you will almost necessarily have to contradict yourself, because you will answer to contradictory elements, or you will try to make sense of something that doesn't make sense at all, and you will lose your time and energy by doing so. So what I think as a faculty, my role is to try and provide keys, and what I do is I didn't develop that much, but to really show all the interesting examples in European law that could be beneficial here in the US, about the protection of Roma children, for instance, in the Czech Republic, of women in Turkey against domestic violence, cases that have to do with homophobic discourses, how to protect people when there is a discourse even before a specific person is designated. So all kind of resources that are useful. So my first answer is to learn from what's going on elsewhere. Of course, I tap into what's going on in Europe because that's where I have expertise, but there are other interesting practices elsewhere, in India, in South Africa, especially. That's the first thing. So to sort of try to take a certain distance with this refusal to acknowledge complexity. And then the second has to do, and this is not something I developed here, but there's an entire chapter in the book about it. What do we do in terms of coalitions? How can we work together? Because if you acknowledge complexity, it means that you have to acknowledge conflicts and contradictions. And I mentioned that a little bit by talking about convergence of struggles, right? But there are, in political and minority struggles, moments when things work hand in hand, and sometimes things that don't work well together. What I find interesting in Adama Traoré's committee, and especially the work of Assa Traoré, is the way she explained that